This man's name is Robert Landsberg, and on a May morning in 1980, at 9:30 a.m., he realized that he had only a few minutes left to live. He understood this when the black cloud of volcanic ash, which he was photographing from a distance of 10 kilometers, began to spread not upward as expected, but toward him. Robert also knew that from afar, this cloud only seemed slow. He glanced at his parked Ford. There was no chance of escaping the flow of scorching gas over the rugged terrain. Then he took his last shots of the eruption, hastily removed the film cassette, and began scanning the area for shelter from the terrifying heat. Time was running out in seconds, and unable to think of anything better, he placed it in a box at the bottom of his backpack and lay on top of it. He could no longer save himself, but the photographs might still survive. It was about them that he was thinking as he covered the backpack with his body when the pyroclastic flow caught up to him. Robert died instantly from thermal shock and inhalation of scorching gases. Who hasn't played the game in childhood where the floor is lava? Even though only a few have seen volcanoes in action, and their eruptions rank among the least likely causes of death. Your average chance of dying from a volcanic eruption in your lifetime is about 1 in 80,000, while the risk of dying in a car accident is 1 in 80. Heck, more people die in elevator accidents than from eruptions. The probability there is 1 in 77,000. So why is the image of lava so universally terrifying? As if in the collective unconscious of humanity, some imprint of ancient horror remains, something like those same Pompeii. Or perhaps our consciousness simply cannot grasp the scale of a force so powerful that it can melt rocks, create mountains, and turn the human brain into glass. Although lava is the last thing that should worry people near an active volcano, it is slow, cools quickly, and is almost harmless compared to the other things volcanoes do. In the case of those same Pompeii, people mistakenly imagine that the city was flooded with lava. But that's not true, in part because Pompeii was 10 kilometers from the volcano, and at the very foot lay another city, Herculaneum, which is a bit more correctly called Ercolano, and it suffered a truly infernal destruction. I recently came across a wonderful reconstruction in its simplicity of the last days in the city of Pompeii, and it really looks like an apocalypse. To be fair, the eruption was preceded by a series of small earthquakes, and about half of the residents in the area got scared enough to gather some things and leave or flee farther away. The brave half stayed, and on an October morning in 79 AD, they met a new series of underground tremors. And then a gigantic column of black smoke and ash burst from the crater of Vesuvius, and a stone rain fell on the city. The sun disappeared, and people in the semi-darkness began to seek shelter. It is believed that at this stage, most survived because the volcano was ejecting pumice rock, which is relatively light. But the treachery of this pumice rain was that it did not stop. By evening, the layer of rocks had reached several meters, and the roofs of houses began to collapse under their weight. Some residents died under the rubble, while others found themselves on the street in pitch darkness without shelter. The veil of ash was so impenetrable that people didn't even know when day turned to night. And with the coming of night, Vesuvius entered the main phase of the eruption. That is, all that daytime nightmare was just a prelude. The eruptive column of ash grew to the stratosphere. That's very high. Vesuvius was ejecting 1.5 million tons of volcanic material per second, and the wind carried this ash to Egypt and Syria. And then the volcano, shuddering, spewed out the first pyroclastic flow, which in 2 seconds completely engulfed the peaceful resort town of Herculaneum at its very foot. A pyroclastic flow is a rapid cloud of scorching gas, ash, and fragments of volcanic rocks that descends the slopes of the volcano at the speed at which a passenger plane takes off, about 300 kilometers per hour and sometimes faster. This is not just dust or smoke, but a dense boiling cloud of death, where the upper layers of gas swirl and glow in the darkness, and boulders and other volcanic debris roll along the ground. Its temperature can reach 1,000 degrees Celsius, and everything in its path instantly burns, melts, and turns into charred remains. You can't escape it even in water. The heavy mass of ash will sink underwater, but the gas will continue to rush across the surface, remaining just as destructive. And such a flow of gases at a temperature of about 700 degrees incinerated the bodies of Herculaneum's residents in 1 second. This temperature was enough for human flesh to literally boil and skulls to explode. Analysis of the remains revealed the result of boiling blood, unusual red and black deposits on bones with abnormally high iron concentrations, and in the skull of one young man, scientists found a brain turned into glass. In these glassy deposits, it was even possible to discern neurons, axons, and some proteins characteristic of brain tissue. This is the only recorded case of natural vitrification of a human brain. And it's not entirely clear what conditions arose for this to happen. Only a hypothesis. For liquid to turn into glass, it must cool so quickly that it doesn't have time to crystallize upon solidification. And for the brain to initially turn into liquid, a very high temperature is needed. Therefore, it is believed that some superhot ash cloud swept through, quickly heating and then cooling the brain tissue. And this was even before the descent of the main pyroclastic flows. The first pyroclastic flow barely touched Pompeii. They were that far from the epicenter. But during the night, Vesuvius ejected 2 more such flows, and each subsequent one became hotter and more deadly. It's impossible to imagine how endless that night seemed to the residents of Pompeii. But by 7 a.m., the 4th and 5th flows descended, and they reached the city, bringing with them a hot cloud of carbon dioxide, chlorides, particles of scorching ash, and volcanic glass. And everyone who survived the night died agonizingly from asphyxiation and lung burns within 15 to 17 minutes. Their respiratory tracts were destroyed by hot gas, and their bodies were buried under a thick layer of ash and rock. Even the remains of horses with raised heads and open mouths reveal the agony in which those who were in the city that night perished. Several more pyroclastic flows and hundreds of millions of tons of ash were spewed out by Vesuvius in the morning, after everything living in the vicinity had already been destroyed. This ash and other eruption products settled on the streets until the city disappeared entirely under them, and then, upon cooling, quickly hardened. Thus, the city was sealed in a rigid stone cocoon for thousands of years and turned into a time capsule. The hardened rocks surrounded the bodies of the dead, preserving their shapes even after the biological matter completely decomposed to teeth and bones. Therefore, when archaeologists began to open this capsule and excavate Pompeii, they discovered unusual pockets in the solidified layers, sometimes containing bones, literally negative casts of people and animals at the moment the flow overtook them. Some were already dead by then, and some were dying at the moment of encounter. Then one Italian archaeologist developed a method of filling these cavities with bones with plaster to obtain casts. It is in this way that we got those famous hundreds of figures. Not mummies, as some think, but precisely casts of the bodies of people at the moment of their horrific death. Absence became presence. The figures depict poses and sometimes even facial expressions. In places, they are so frighteningly detailed that clothing is visible. For example, the dress of a young woman, lifted and twisted around her waist. Over 1.5 centuries, archaeologists have found about 1,000 such negative imprints of bodies with bones, and more than 100 of them have been turned into plaster casts. Considering that they have only just begun, this is already a whole army of plaster figures, curled up, lying, crawling, frightened, and praying. Another 1,000 await their turn, reliably preserved under tons of rock surrounded by objects of ancient daily life that scientists have yet to discover. The horrific fate of Pompeii, Herculaneum, and the neighboring cities of Atlantis and Stabi consisted in the insufficient understanding of the people of what threatened them. Yes, for 17 years before that, the residents of the area were frightened by periodic earthquakes, and there were even some warnings. But the illiterate and poor majority couldn't really believe them, and they probably had nowhere to go. From the start of the stone rain, people still had a time window of several hours to escape. And some, most likely the richest, managed to sail away from the volcano on ships. And as a result, the number of victims, approximately 16,000 across all 4 cities, turned out to be much less than it could have been. But that's still a huge number. And here one wants to say, well, probably over 2,000 years, humanity has learned a lot, and people wouldn't repeat such an experience in the 20th century. But no, this is the port city of Saint-Pierre on the island of Martinique, a French overseas territory in the Caribbean Sea. In a sense, it is a sister city to Pompeii. Both are prosperous trading and cultural centers of comparable size, with a favorable resort climate, and most importantly, both are located dangerously close to volcanoes. Saint-Pierre was one of the most developed colonial cities, and it was called the Caribbean Paris. There were trams, electricity, international banks, and, of course, hotels for numerous tourists from France who came to enjoy the Caribbean tropics. The city was located at the foot of the massive Mont Pelee volcano, about 1.5 km high. Although the volcano was active, it was considered not to pose a serious threat. Residents were accustomed to the periodic rumble of its bowels and the ash occasionally ejected from it. This even added attractiveness to the resort. In the main crater, a beautiful clear lake formed, and many liked to have picnics around it. Such idyllic life ceased to seem so by April 1902, when steam with ash began to rise from the crater more frequently, and the air smelled of sulfur. At first, no one paid attention to it, but by the end of April, residents began to be noticeably bothered by the ash falling from the sky, and an expedition to the summit was undertaken. There, a team of scientists, or rather those performing their functions, discovered that the previously dry secondary crater, located lower on the mountain, was now full of bubbling sulfuric water. Overall, this surge in Mount Peely's activity was perceived as just another curious natural phenomenon, not fully understood and a bit exciting. There were no volcanologists in the city, but geophysical knowledge at that time was generally insufficient. By the beginning of May, the situation continued to worsen. The smell of sulfur was so strong that people going outside tried to breathe through a handkerchief. There were isolated reports of horses, which, being outside all the time, fell right in their harness. The city was flooded with small creatures descending from the mountain, among which were giant centipedes and venomous rattlesnakes. It is said that more than 50 townspeople died from snake bites in the lead-up to the eruption. Ash accumulated everywhere, and dead birds and animal carcasses were encountered here and there on the streets. Tourists began to leave, and the local population noticeably tensed and started talking about evacuation. But almost as much as the residents worried about their lives, the governor of Martinique, Louis Moudet, worried about the outcome of the additional elections to the Chamber of Deputies scheduled in Saint-Pierre for May. The last thing he wanted was for his electoral base, the layer of white affluent citizens, to scatter who knows where on election day. He did everything he could to calm the population, convincing them that nothing terrible threatened them. On May 5th, 6 days before the elections, a crack formed in the crater. The contents of the lake mixed with ash and loose rocks and formed a mud avalanche. It raced down the slope, destroying the railroad and a sugar factory along the way, where 25 workers died. Then all this mass crashed into the sea and caused 3 3-meter tsunamis that flooded the waterfront and damaged ships in the port. Governor Moudet created a commission of experts from local teachers and military engineers, none of whom understood volcanology. The commission concluded that the danger was insignificant, and the mud flows were a sign of the volcano's subsidence. The population calmed down a bit. The incident itself seemed to them like the final catastrophe, after which everything should return to normal. But literally the next day, on a neighboring island, another small volcano erupted, killing, by some estimates, about 1,500 people. When this news reached Saint-Pierre, panic and mass exodus of residents finally set in, to the horror of the governor. Then Moudet sent troops to the city supposedly to establish order. But all they established were checkpoints on the roads leading out of the city. Soldiers stopped people and sent them back to Saint-Pierre. Just imagine this picture. Thousands of people were forcibly held at the foot of a volcano threatening eruption at any moment. Some high-ranking officials, as usual, were still able to leave somewhere farther away. And a day later, on May 7th, the governor and his family demonstratively arrived in Saint-Pierre. This is how they decided to set an example and show the frightened population that all their fears were groundless. And the next morning, May 8th at 7:52, Mont Peely exploded, releasing a huge cloud of superhot gas. A surviving eyewitness, who was on board a ship anchored off the coast, described the scene like this. There was no warning. The side of the volcano tore open, and a wall of flame moved toward us. The wave of fire overtook us lightning fast. This fiery hurricane directly crashed onto Saint-Pierre and the ships. The city disappeared before our eyes. The wall of flame, as you have already guessed, was a pyroclastic flow. Over Saint-Pierre, it reached a temperature of 1,000 degrees. People died instantly, evaporating or turning into charcoal. Those protected from the blast by barriers like walls experienced brief moments of agony as their skin began to burst and blood boiled. Those farthest from the epicenter died suffocating from hot toxic gas. The governor and his family, of course, also perished. On the ships in the harbor, people on deck were showered with scorching fragments of rock. These shards burned through clothing, stuck to skin, and baked people alive. People jumping into the sea heard their own flesh hissing upon contact with the water. Of the 18 ships in the harbor, only one was able to sail away. All the others were overturned or engulfed in flames. Not long after, one of the first witnesses who entered the destroyed St. Pierre described the scene like this. The entire city was turned into a pile of smoking debris. Walls destroyed, roofs torn off, trees completely stripped of leaves, charred bodies lying everywhere. We saw no sign of life, not a single living soul in these dusty ruins. The destruction of the city was absolute. In photos, St. Pierre resembles Hiroshima after the bombing. Destroyed buildings, roads littered with debris, mutilated human remains, charred and scattered bones on the streets. All 30,000 people died in a matter of seconds. There was almost no chance of survival for anyone. However, when the probability approaches zero but is not equal to it, people like Auguste Cypris appear, the only documented survivor whose face and name are known to history. Louis Auguste Cypris, though according to other documents he is Ludger Silberis, ended up in the wrong place but at the right time. At the moment of the eruption, he was in some semblance of a holding cell in the police station. 6 days before, Cypris had been arrested for a drunken brawl during which he stabbed someone in the chest with a knife. According to some sources, he was charged with murder, according to others, armed assault. The day before the eruption, he tried to escape, for which he was placed in solitary confinement for 8 days. This cell, built in the mid-15th century, was a small semi-basement room without windows, with a single wooden door and a small slit with a grate for ventilation. The main factor in his survival was the thick stone walls and poor ventilation. The cell was partially cut into the mountain and located in a protected hollow behind the prison walls, and the ventilation hole was small and directed away from the volcano, so the deadly gases did not have time to fill it. But despite the cell's protection, he received serious burns to his hands, legs, and back. He later recalled the sudden darkness and unbearable heat. I felt nothing but the smell of my own burning body and heard nothing but my own cries for help. He spent 3 days alone in the cell in a city of the dead until a rescue team arriving from a neighboring commune heard his weak moans. After lengthy treatment, he was pardoned and even hired by some circus in the USA, where he displayed scars and welts, telling audiences the story of his miraculous survival. He was presented to the public as the sole survivor. But to be completely accurate, 2 more survived in the city. A shoemaker who hid either in a river or in a basement, and a young girl who managed to sail away in a boat. But very little is known about them, that is, almost nothing except what I said. Despite the fame, Cypris died in poverty from illness in 1929. And, by the way, in the same year, Mont Pelee produced another eruption. It generally continued to erupt actively throughout the first third of the 20th century, sometimes with earthquakes. Therefore, enthusiasts' attempts to restore the city failed, and Martinique's residents moved to live on neighboring islands. But that very initial eruption, many times surpassing the one in Pompeii, became the 3rd most catastrophic in recorded human history. The survival rate in it was extremely low and amounted to less than 1%. But the island began to attract daring geologists thanks to a stunning phenomenon: the Tower of Pelee. This is a gigantic lava spike that grew under pressure from the crater 330 m upward, about like the Eiffel Tower or an 80-story building. In the nighttime darkness, it glowed a deep red color. It could have become a wonderful attraction for tourism development, but unfortunately, over the course of a year, the tower continued to grow until it collapsed under its own weight. And today, nothing remains of it. In general, as they say, this has never happened before. And here it is again. And yet, if we disregard the political interests and irresponsibility of the governor, who can boldly be considered the key culprit of the tragedy, we should also make allowance for the fact that volcanology as a science at the beginning of the century was still in its infancy, in such an infancy that the eruption of Mont Pelee gave its name to one of the main types of eruptions, the Pelean type. And what about the photographer Robert Landsberg, whom I mentioned at the very beginning? By the day he was taking his photographs, 80 years had passed since the story on Martinique. Since then, volcanology had advanced far ahead, and this was not somewhere in island colonies, but in the United States of America. How could Robert, along with another 50 people, including other photographers and scientists, perish so tragically? It all began in 1980, when the relatively young volcano by geological standards, Mount St. Helens, after 123 years, began to awaken. Like all volcanoes, St. Helens goes through periods of activity and dormancy. Winters in the area were shaken by dozens and hundreds of small earthquakes, and the crater occasionally spewed ash or steam. But what alarmed scientists was a strange, gigantic bulge that began to form on the northern side of the mountain and grew day by day. They assumed that the bulge was being lifted by magma pressing from a deep fracture. But this strange bulge also attracted hundreds of curious people who came to the mountain at a distance they themselves considered safe for them. The police tried to prevent them, but with the size of St. Helens and the surrounding territory, controlling all roads proved impossible. When the police got tired of this endless fuss, the governor had to declare a state of emergency and involve the National Guard to directly dissuade arrivals on the roads. But what do you think? They managed to scare and dissuade only a small part of them. Therefore, on April 30th, a red zone had to be created around the volcano. The size of the zone was calculated by scientists, estimating the area that could be destroyed in the event of a vertical eruption of the volcano, which became more likely every day. Only scientists, law enforcement officers, and journalists were allowed inside this zone. And again, this met with discontent from local residents who did not want to leave their homes. Loggers working in the forests around the mountain were outraged, as were simply the curious who wanted to gawk at the volcano up close. On May 18th at 8:32 a.m., the mountain shuddered from another earthquake, and a gigantic landslide rushed down its slope, the largest in the history of Earth studies, moving at a speed of 250 kilometers per hour. This landslide tore off 1,000 tons of mountain rock from the bulge on the northern slope, thus weakening it. And in the next moment, the mountain, weakened on one side, exploded with energy equivalent to 1,500 Hiroshima atomic bombs. This explosion blew away a whole kilometer of the mountain, and the expanding magma ejected 1,000 tons of scorching rocks and gas from the crater. The pyroclastic flow completely destroyed everything within a fan-shaped zone with a radius of 13 kilometers and burned trees at a distance of almost 30 kilometers. Within this zone, at least 57 people died, and that's only those whose bodies were found. Among them were scientists observing the explosion. For example, the 30-year-old volcanologist David Johnston, who, by the way, owned the idea of convincing the government not to open the red zone earlier, which saved many lives. There were also those who simply did not want to leave their home. For example, 83-year-old Harry Truman stated in a TV interview that, despite the danger and fear, he would not leave his home and the life that he and his late wife had built together. The pyroclastic flow killed him and his 16 cats. The eruption of St. Helens was classified precisely as Plinian, that is, similar in mechanics to Vesuvius. And we remember how unimaginably much ash and rock ends up in the air during such an eruption. These clouds covered neighboring states. Ash particles in the air caused lightning, and lightning provoked numerous forest fires. Ash clogged mechanisms, caused short circuits in electrical transformers, killed livestock, and polluted drinking water. Over 2 weeks, the ash plumes circled the entire globe. But that wasn't all. The eruption melted some mountain glaciers, and the mud flows rushing downward washed away infrastructure along rivers and destroyed homes. Navigation in the volcano area became impossible because the territory around it no longer matched any existing maps of the area. St. Helens caused billions of dollars in damage. Even just to clear the roads, workers had to remove almost 1 million tons of ash from them. The volcano continues to be in an active phase today. In the early 2000s, for example, it again spewed ash and steam and still forms lava domes in the crater. Among the victims were at least 2 photographers. Reed Blackburn was caught by the pyroclastic flow in his car during an attempt to drive away from it. The car was found almost up to the roof buried in ash, and the camera's film was destroyed by the temperature. However, a couple of decades later, these earlier shots of St. Helens activity from another of his films, which he took a couple of weeks before his death, were developed. But Robert Landsberg didn't even try to race the elements and focused on saving the shots. The box with the film that he covered with himself to protect from the heat was dug up. The shots were developed and became famous worldwide. The tragedies of Pompeii, Herculaneum, St. Pierre, and St. Helens, separated by centuries and thousands of kilometers, amazingly echo each other in how unimaginably powerful nature is compared to us, and in how similar mistakes people can make. If you haven't seen my video about White Island Volcano, the link to it will be somewhere here. Watch it for sure. An amazing story about very recent eruptions with completely horrifying videos and accounts from survivors inside the pyroclastic flow. Despite the obvious differences in the level of scientific understanding and technological development, All these stories show one thing: how small and fragile we are in the face of the elements. It's as if we learn the same lesson anew each time, that true safety lies not in trying to resist the elements, but in the ability to recognize danger in time and get out of its way. Well, as always, friends, take care of yourselves and your loved ones. This was the mistake of the non-survivor. See you.